This is our retreat tape on.
I'd like to welcome you to the 2004 Flint Retreat. And we are welcoming all our Carmelite brothers and sisters in Sri Lanka, in Brazil, in Atlanta, in Lansing, in Flint, in Burton, and all of you that are listening to learn what the Lord has to speak to our hearts. Let us welcome Father Mark Foley OCD, our treasured retreat master, with his first conference on St Therese and Scruples.
St Therese and Scruples. Mark Foley, OCD, Father Mark Foley.
Everyone. Let's just take a moment and place ourselves in God's presence. St. Therese, in this conference and the next conference, we're going to be looking at three interrelated realities in the life of St. Therese. Her scrupulosity, her trial of faith. We know that in the last 18 months of her life, she was in darkness. She did not believe in the existence of heaven. In fact, that's the way she died. She never came out of it, by the way. And also her separation anxiety that was triggered by separations from her mother, from the death of her mother, and also from the separation of her second mother, Pauline. These talks are based upon two assumptions. The first is that we only have one life with various dimensions that interrelate and impact upon one another. We don't have a spiritual life. We don't have an emotional life. We don't have a social life or an intellectual life or a sex life as isolated monads that have no relationship to one another. We might say that the spiritual life is our response to God's presence within the context of the whole of who we are, bodily, emotionally, psychologically, socially, and historically. It's very important to approach saints within the context of their life. Otherwise, they become cardboard figures. They cease to be models for our life because they become very unreal. It's only when we realize the choices they made within the struggles of their life that they can become models of our life. St. Therese wrote in her last conversations, she said that if the saints came back to earth, most of them would not recognize themselves by what we say and write about them, And so when we put saints so far on a pedestal that they become unreal, either we get discouraged because there's nothing we can imitate, or we feel guilty because there's no way we can compete. I mean, either scenario is not helpful. So it's very important to look at the saints within the context of their life. The second major assumption is that the emotional wounds of our life, especially those of childhood, do not cease to impact us when childhood ends. This was very true with St. Therese. The two emotional wounds that seared Therese's childhood was separation anxiety and her almost addiction to mother figures, and also her scrupulosity that she ingested from the culture of her time. And what I will argue is that both of these played a part in her trial of faith, which we will be talking about in our second conference. When we read Story of a Soul, it's very easy to get the erroneous impression that Therese's separation anxiety, her scrupulosity, and her doubts in faith were trials to a particular time in her life. This is not true. They are things that ran the gamut of her whole life. We know, for example, that when she was in Carmel, she found it very, very difficult to detach herself from her second mother, Pauline. In fact, she writes in the autobiography, she says, "It was a constant source of suffering for me. It was one of the biggest sufferings to live with my sisters when not to give in to my natural inclinations." Because that was her primal addiction, to be mothered and to stay a little China doll as she was overprotected within her family of origin, okay? And she fought against that as an adult. Or, for example, regarding her scrupulosity, when we read Story of a Soul, we read that when she was 12 and a half years old, she suffered a bout of scrupulosity when she made her second First Communion retreat, and it lasted for 18 months. We can get the impression that after those 18 months, her problems with scrupulosity were over. But this is not true. In the beatification testimonies that her sisters gave, they testified that during all of Therese's retreats in Carmel, both her private retreats and her community retreats, she used to get physically ill because she was tortured by the fear of the reoccurrence of an attack of scruples, and for good reasons. Because the priests that were giving the conferences in Carmel at the time had a real Jansenistic flavor, very similar to the priests that gave Therese's First Communion retreat. When something in the present sounds very similar to something in the past, it brings up the old fears. Pauline testifies, quote, "The fear of offending God was poisoning Therese's life." That's a very, very powerful statement. We know that Therese believed in merciful love. She believed in a merciful God. But that does not mean she always felt at every moment that God was merciful. What Therese had within her is we have different images of God within us. And her primary image of God was God as a loving God. But she also, this image of God as a loving God, was infected by the God of her times. Okay? And when she was afraid, this second God reared its face. Or, for example, regarding her doubts in the existence of heaven that she experienced in the last 18 months of her life. Therese writes in her autobiography, quote, "At that time, I was having great interior trials of all kinds, even to the point of asking myself whether heaven really existed." At that time. The time she is referring to is during a retreat that she made 5 years before the onset of her trial of faith. Her doubts in the existence of heaven wasn't something that just came once. This was something that came throughout her life. This was a part of her own psyche. We'll be talking about in our second conference why this was a part of her own mentality. So Therese's separation anxiety from mother figures, her tendency towards scrupulosity, and her doubts and faith were part and parcel of the psychic landscape of her life. That was part of her own psyche that she lived with all of her life. So, with these introductory remarks, let us first begin by looking at scrupulosity in Therese's life. Scrupulosity is an extremely painful anxiety disorder that consists of the gnawing fear that one has either offended God or could seriously offend God at any moment and as a result be cast into hell. Now, considering the incredible fear that such a belief engenders, what the scrupulous person is looking for is something they can never have. They are seeking absolute certitude that they have never sinned, that they have not sinned seriously. Ironically, it's the quest for this absolute certitude that engenders the doubt that they have sinned. Because when a scrupulous person feels that he or she has achieved absolute certitude that they haven't sinned, there's a nagging voice inside of them that says, "But are you sure?" In other words, the conscious certitude triggers the unconscious doubt. Because whenever we are holding on to something so tightly, the opposite gathers energy in the unconscious. Trying to avoid something is a means of attending to it. If I asked you, for example, not to think of pink elephants for the next 10 seconds, now try not to think of pink elephants. What happens when you try not to think of pink elephants? You think of pink elephants. Because avoidance is a means of attention. It's like when you try to push a car spring down, the energy you expend in pushing it down goes into the coil, which will make it come up. The fear that I've sinned of pushing that doubt down gives energy to that doubt that takes on a voice, "But are you sure?" Okay, so you see the dynamic that goes on here. Okay. In obsessive compulsive disorders, and scrupulosity is a subspecies of a compulsion is an action that alleviates the anxiety engendered by that thought. Now, let's say, for example, you're driving down one of the back roads of Michigan. It's at night, and as you're driving, you feel a bump as you go over something. And about a mile down the road, the thought comes to your mind, "My God, did I run over someone?" You know, it just comes to you, and it frightens you. So, just to make sure, you would turn around and go back and check the road. Now, when you checked the road and there was no one there, how would you feel? You feel relieved, wouldn't you? Now, that's very, very normal. Now, the dividing line, which isn't clear between normal and neurotic, is that with an obsessive compulsive, since they need absolute certitude, they have to continue to check. They come back, nobody's there. So they keep on going down the road, and all of a sudden they say, well, maybe I just wounded a person, and they crawl into the bushes. Well, put yourself, so they go back, check, scurry around the bushes, nobody's there. They drive down the road, and all of a sudden, a thought comes to their mind. As I was driving down, I saw a car coming towards me. I wonder if they saw the person, picked up the person, and brought him to the hospital. So to make sure, they'd go to the nearby hospital. And they would be relieved that nobody was brought into the emergency room. So they're driving away. They realize that there's more than one hospital, this can become very, very serious. People have, when I was doing my master's in counseling, and they gave examples of this, there were actual college professors that had to quit their job because they could not make a decision of what to wear that day. It literally destroyed their life. This can be an extremely debilitating anxiety disorder. And every time the person checks and sees that they haven't run over anyone, the anxiety is relieved. And because the anxiety is relieved, the checking reinforces the checking. If every time I feel anxious, and all of a sudden I kick somebody in the shin, and all my anxiety goes away, what am I going to do the next time I feel anxious? I'm going to kick somebody in the shin. Because, in other words, the action that relieves the anxiety, I become addicted to, okay? And therefore, the obsessive compulsive gets caught in what is called an anxiety relief cycle. A common anxiety relief cycle that scrupulous people get caught into is going to confession. They go to confession, they feel guilty, both real guilt, and they feel guilty for doing nothing. They go in, they confess, they feel relieved, they leave. Halfway down the aisle, they get this thought, gee, was it 2 or 3 times that I had this impure thought? Father, I was in here 5 minutes ago, and I think it was 3 times I had impure thoughts, but I'm not too sure if it was full consent or 7/8%. But, and they dissect everything. How can you get absolute certitude when you're trying to figure it out? You can't do it. So the priest gives them absolution, and they leave, they get in their car, and what happens? Something else comes up, and they go back, Now, when Therese was 12 and a half years old, she was caught for 18 months in an anxiety relief cycle. Every time Therese believed that a thought was slightly sinful, she would run to Marie, her sister, try to get absolute certitude that she hadn't sinned. She felt relief momentarily until the next anxiety-ridden thought came into her mind, and she would run back to Marie. Now, with what I've just said about the dynamics of scrupulosity, listen to the anxiety relief cycle that Therese speaks about in her autobiography. Quote, one would have to pass through this martyrdom. And this is not histrionics. This is, the real fear of scrupulosity, One would have to pass through this martyrdom to understand well, and for me to express what I suffered for a year and a half would be impossible. All my most simple thoughts and actions became the cause of trouble for me, and I had relief only when I told them to Marie. This cost me dearly, for I believed I was obliged to tell her all the absurd thoughts I had even about her. Now think about this for a second. What if you felt obliged to confess every absurd thought that goes through your mind? That's a full-time job. You'd be working overtime, wouldn't you? I would. Okay. And she continues, as soon as I lay down my burden by telling Marie about my thoughts, I experienced peace in an instant. But this peace passed away like a lightning flash, and soon my martyrdom began again. What patience my dear Marie needed to listen to me without showing any annoyance. Do you see the anxiety relief cycle that Therese was going through? She had an anxiety-ridden thought. She gets relief by running to Marie, only for a moment until the next thought comes. Now, the mind of a scrupulous person is haunted by the specter of a wrathful God. And such a God, in the guise of Jansenism, haunted 19th century France. Now, Jansenism, a heresy condemned by the Church, emphasized the depravity of human nature and its inclination towards sin. It preached divine justice that was so stern and exacting that only a few were saved. It taught that sacramental absolution did not forgive sins, but only declared them forgiven to the person who already possessed the perfect love of God. Now, I don't fall into that category. Any of you? Okay. Likewise, Jansenism held that it was only the unsullied soul, free of all taint of sin, that could approach the communion rail without fear of committing a sacrilege. Its piety was grim and excessively moralistic. It was rooted in an image of God as a harsh judge of unyielding justice. And the possibility of committing a mortal sin is an ever constant and present danger. You know, there's something very attractive about this type of God. And what's attractive about this type of God is because of strict justice. If I can line up in my mind, in kind of black and white categories, what's a mortal sin and what isn't, and there's a dividing line, if I'm absolutely sure that I'm on this side of the line, then I have the assurance of heaven. There's something in the psyche that wants to believe in that God. Because first of all, it limits our response. All I have to worry about is, and for Catholics, it's usually around the 6th and 9th commandment. You know, for Catholics, the 6th and the 9th commandments are the greatest of all commandments because there are more creative ways of offending God with those sins than any other sin, you know. I mean, that's, you know. No, but basically, I think what happens is, erroneously, what we get into our minds is an erroneous equation that if something feels good, it must be bad, right? And if sex feels really good, it must be really bad. I mean, we don't say this consciously, but that's on a feeling level, that's, I mean, I was brought up in the Catholic school system, taught by, Irish Catholic nuns, and the Irish clergy was very, very Jansenistic, and the American church became very, very Jansenistic, okay? And this becomes part of our psycho-God. And the belief system, the corporate punishing superego among Therese's day and its attendant fears gave an excessive rise to introspection, which was the breeding ground for scrupulosity. They dissected every action just to make sure that they hadn't committed a mortal sin. And Jansenism tainted the pulpit and the Catholic pedagogy, which in turn infected the faithful. Now, the segment of the faithful that we are really concerned about here in the life of St. Therese was those that had immediate contact with Therese, namely her family and her relatives. For example, Zélie, Therese's mother, grew up in a very Jansenistic home. In her documentation for Zélie's her process of becoming venerable, we read that in her family, the home was dominated by, quote, a certain atmosphere of austerity, constraint, and scrupulosity. Zélie's mother taught her daughters an excessive fear of offending God and used to harp on the phrase, this is a quote from one of her sisters, quote, that's a sin, to curb the least imperfections, unquote. Zélie's sister, Marie Louise, quote, had feared to commit the grave sin of finding herself near a little boy. She would slip away trembling, sometimes bringing malicious teasing upon herself because what others interpreted as her wild temperament. I think the word is hysteria, Zélie exhibited the same symptom on her wedding night. Remember, on her wedding night, as Louis approached her, she became so afraid, she became hysterical. And as a result, Louis backed away. And it was at this moment he proposed, living as brother and sister. This wasn't something holy. This was something that Zélie could not handle. Zélie's relationship with her mother was, quote, and these are her own words now, too austere, and she treated me harshly, and as a result, my youth was as sad as a winding sheet, that is, a shroud. Zélie had a very melancholic temperament, and depression both aggravates and triggers obsessive thinking. Zélie was petrified that her 5-year-old daughter, Helene, who died, was in purgatory or possibly even in hell because she had once lied. This is how severe it was. And we all know that especially the mother, the emotional atmosphere of the mother is the emotional atmosphere of the child. If the mother is anxious, the child becomes very, very anxious. For example, I don't know if you remember, but when Therese was small, Zélie was extremely anxious because of many, many factors. Her children had couple of her children had died before Therese. She was frightened that Therese would die. Leone, who was a real problem, we would be talking about in our last conference, was kicked out of the boarding school because of her personality problems. She was dying of cancer herself. She said her mind, Zélie says her mind was becoming unhinged as a result of this. She was so anxious, remember at that time, that Therese would not breastfeed from Zélie. And at the time, it was diagnosed as a form of a gastric disorder within Therese's stomach. But when when Zélie went to get the wet nurse, Rose Tallee, Therese began to nurse instantly. When Zélie left the room, her anxious presence, Therese relaxed, and she was able to nurse, for hours. So the whole atmosphere, the whole emotional atmosphere of a parent very much affects the child. Now, I think there's one thing I'd like to say here, and I think this is important for parents to hear, because I think parents carry an incredible amount of unnecessary guilt for no reason whatsoever. Zélie is a person who is venerable, who probably will be beatified. Here was a loving mother. Here was a holy woman. But no matter how loving, no matter how holy you are, you can't protect your children from yourself. John of the Cross, when he speaks about the dark night of the soul, the dark night of the spirit, he says, it's, quote, bearing all the evil, not of one's making. Zélie passed on to Therese what was passed on to her. And her mother probably got it from the society at large. This is part of original sin, things that are passed down from generation to generation to generation. We pass on to people we live with, we pass on to our children the good parts of us, but also the wounded parts of us. And it has nothing to do with conscious evil in our life. It's things that's the way we are. And it's like osmosis. They just pick it up. Okay, so far so good. Because I think a lot of parents think, what have I done? The answer is nothing. Nothing. Guilt is the result of a conscious, willful choice. And there's no guilt there. There's no culpability. But we can do a lot of damage even though we're not culpable. Because it's part of being born into a broken world. You can't be born into a broken world without becoming broken yourself. There's no other choice. That's part of original sin. Now, the question, when was Therese first infected by scrupulosity? Well, the answer is, we really don't know. But I think it was very early in life. And that's what's made her vulnerable to her first major attack of scruples at 12 and a half. For example, how do you interpret the following passages? When Therese was 3.5 years old, and this is the time when the conscience or the superego is beginning to be formed, Zélie writes to her daughter Pauline the following. Therese becomes emotional very easily. As soon as she does anything wrong, everyone has to know about it. Yesterday, not meaning to do so, she tore off a small piece of wallpaper. She wanted to tell her father immediately, and you would have pitied to see her anxiety. Don't put a halo around this, folks. This is a mother concerned about her child. There's something wrong here. That's what she's writing to, I mean, Zaley's had, like 9 kids. There's something different here. A year later, Marie writes to Pauline, quote, Therese is very sensitive, and when she said a word too many, or when she made a mistake, she notices it immediately and makes up for it. The poor baby has recourse to tears, and she asks pardon, which never ends. We tell her she's forgiven, but in vain. She goes on crying all the same. Don't interpret that as a sign of holiness. Now, how do we interpret these passages? Are they indications of a sensitive conscience, of a child beyond her years? Considering that Therese was precociously intelligent and reflective, I think we might be able to answer in the affirmative. But do these passages not also indicate an incipient scrupulosity? First, these passages that I just read, Zaley and Marie are concerned about Therese's behavior. Second, these passages manifest common characteristics of scrupulous persons. For example, an excessive fear of being punished by any transgression, things that are even done by accident, the tearing off of a piece of wallpaper. Therese finds it difficult to believe that she is forgiven after she receives forgiveness. Now, this is not an isolated incident. As we'll find out in a little while, when Therese was in Carmel, even after going to confession and receiving sacramental absolution, she doubted whether she was forgiven. So this went through all of her life. Now, it was this tendency in her early life towards scrupulosity that made her a prime candidate for a major attack of scruples that she experienced at the age of 12 and a half. Now, in 1884, when Therese is 11 and a half years old, she made her first communion retreat, conducted by Father Domin. And the retreat was a very uplifting, a very upbeat retreat. The titles of his conferences were, quote, Hell, Mortal Sin, Judgment, the necessity of making a good confession, and sacrilegious communion. Therese wrote in her retreat notes, quote, he spoke about mortal sin and described the soul in the state of sin and how much God hated it. Now, if you already have a tendency to believe in a Jansenistic God that growls down and looks at you, this is going to confirm your worst fears. Because somebody who's standing up in front of you, who represents the supreme authority of the church, is putting the good housekeeping seal of approval on your fears. What Father Domin said frightened Therese. But in this first communion retreat, it did not trigger an attack of scruples. It was the following year, when Therese made her second First Communion retreat, that her attack of scruples came. The situation was similar. Therese goes back to the same retreat house, and Father Domin, brought back by popular demand, is giving the same retreat. Okay? But now there's something different. Therese is 12 and a half years old. What's going on in her life now that wasn't going on a year before? She's entering into puberty. Whenever something is triggered off at a particular moment, a good question to ask is, why now? Why not a year before? What is it in this particular situation now that made the difference? The fact that it's very important, I think, to realize why the fact that Therese is coming into puberty was a significant factor in the triggering off of a major scrupulous episode. First of all, we need to be clear that we're not talking about sexual temptation here. Therese said she never had a problem with that. I'm going to take that on faith. There are certain things beyond your experience, your imagination, you can't even imagine. Well, I'm taking that on faith. Okay. Now, her sister Celine, Sister Genevieve, had real problems with temptations towards chastity. Just parenthetically, when Celine was Therese's novice, and Celine went to Therese and talked to her about these violent temptations against chastity, Therese's response was, "Isn't that wonderful?" And the reason she gave is, she says, Celine, I've never had problems in this area. I've got problems in a lot of other areas, but never in this area. And it's really wonderful that us, and Celine was her favorite sister, that both of us can kind of like struggle with the whole of human nature together. This was a wonderful response, a very sane response that Therese gave, a very pastoral response that Therese gave to her sister Celine. The significance of Therese coming into puberty as a catalyst that triggered off her scrupulosity is that all the chemical and hormonal and physical, emotional, psychological, and interpersonal changes that are taking place at that time are extremely confusing. And if there's any state of mind that a scrupulous person needs and wants, a person who wants absolute certitude, if there's any state of mind that they find so anxiety-ridden, it's ambiguity. And that's the significance of coming into puberty. My God, are these strange bodily feelings? Are these the feelings that Father Domini was talking about? I'm attracted to little Pierre over there. Is my attraction to him, is this a mortal sin? Well, if you're prone to that, and you want absolute certitude, how do you get absolute certitude about something that you don't even understand? We're not talking about St. Therese now. We're talking about a 12-and-a-half-year-old child. And I think that's what you need to keep in mind is the context. And even as adults, do you know, I'm not talking about intellectually now, do you know experientially the difference between being sexually aroused and lust? On the level of experience, when you're right in the midst of it, it's very, very hard to distinguish, isn't it? Now, intellectually, I can say, well, being sexually aroused is a normal, natural thing. Lust is a choice that attends upon that condition. But when you're in the experience of it,
This is the end of our first conference with Father Mark Foley. Leave your comments in the comments section, and we can have him back again if there's positive indication that people want to hear more about this. Keep him and Little Flower in your prayer. Again, Father Mark Foley, Discus Carmelite of the Washington, D.C. province here in the United States.